Okay, your specialty is musicals.
Hmm.
How do you get interested in the study of musicals? And what's your background? Do you have any background that allows you to study musicals?
Oh, a couple of things. All my degrees have been in theater, so I started out getting a bachelor's at Emerson College, theater, and Ohio University, theater, and then the University of Michigan, theater. Also, I came from New York City. This helps a little bit in one's study of musicals because as a kid, I was one of those people who other kids on the block would listen to Elvis Presley and the Platters, etc. And I'd be home listening to Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Lowe and My Fair Lady. In those days, it was so cheap to go to plays that every year I'd save up my money, my $18, $20. Then I'd run down to Broadway and get about 7 pairs of theater tickets. This was way back, way back. So as a result, I saw a heck of a lot in my life with the New York, going to the New York Theater. I must have seen about, what would it be, about 250 shows. So I've seen practically every major musical starting in with the mid-50s that is played on Broadway. I will say this, I also had a talent for going on the day when the big star I paid all the money or whatever it was to see wasn't there. I saw Linda Gerard in Funny Girl. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for. I saw Luther Adler in Fiddler on the Roof 2 weeks after Zero Mostel left the cast. It just went on and on like that. But I was able to see them all. So I loved the musical as child and man since I first knew about it. I remember my mother dragging me to the theater. She was into teaching and she loved musicals too. And first show I saw about 1950 was Boris Karloff and Jean Arthur in Peter Pan, which I think Leonard Bernstein, wrote the music for that. Then the second show I saw was South Pacific, so I was hooked way back from the early 50s. So it's just been sort of an interest or a passion. And I just found myself gravitating toward theater and film and whatnot. Just the natural interests that I have are there.
Is there any kind of change or shift that you see in theater from the 50s to the present?
It's more expensive. I mean, I just said something like buying 7 pairs of theater tickets for $18. You cannot buy one theater ticket for $18 nowadays. And yes, the vibrancy that was there. I mean, you could go down there and the theaters filled all over the place, and you had major stars and whatnot, and it was just heaven on earth because there was so much doing. You go now to the theater on Broadway, there is so much less. I mean, all the costs and whatnot make things so prohibitive. Now you want to see what? 10, 11 shows, you better have $500, $600 with you to allow you to see that many shows. So that's one thing. And also it was a bouncier period. I mean, nowadays we all know about the British dominance, right? We now live in the Lloyd Webber era of the American musical. I've always wanted to do a course where I teach on the American musical, but now if I'm asked to do it, I'd say it's got to be the musical, not the American musical, because the British dominance is so great. But in the old days, it was, you didn't see British musicals. British musicals were dull, slow things, you know. Maybe Lionel Bart would come out with Oliver. That was a little jumpier, but who thought the Brits could do anything in that area? I mean, the Brits did Shakespeare. That was their specialty. The musical was our big thing. And at that age, remember that I was growing up with Lerner and Lowe, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Frank Lesser, just some of the people turning out these musicals. It's the age of Mary Martin, Ethel Merman, Gwen Verdon, Alfred Drake, etc. So it's a very vibrant period, and it's the years that you get the cutting edge. Gower Champion and Bob Fosse, Michael Bennett and whatnot are cutting their teeth, getting ready for the next generation. Stephen Sondheim's coming in the late 50s, or West Side Story, and Gypsy. Again, it's the cutting edge for the next generation. So it was really an exciting period.
Why the 50s? Mm-hmm. Why the 50s, the golden age of the musical? Or was there a previous age of the musical?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you go back into theater history, and I am a theater history nut. That's where my tie-up usually is, musicals and history. And you will find you've had golden ages all the way through the 20s, going on, just one generation coming after the other. You could go back to Victor Herbert and George M. Cohan and whatnot in the 1900s. And then you get into Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, Vincent Youmans, Cole Porter coming in the 20s, going on the 30s to the 40s, Rodgers and Hart. And you find you're going to be getting Rodgers and Hammerstein going on into the 40s, 50s. So you had golden ages. They were just different types of golden ages with different values. Things like the book was non-existent in musicals in the 1920s. You know, who's going to win the football game for Winsaki U or something like that is enough of an excuse. Just let Gershwin write the score and Fred Astaire and his sister Adele dance in it, or Marilyn Miller appear, and you are going to have a musical. The excuse for the musical was the musical, period. They didn't think about the book that much. Or else you'd have, say, the review, the Ziegfeld Follies, which has been I've been very interested in these huge monster glamour shows of Ziegfeld and Earl Carroll, George White, etc. All of those producers of these monster things with 8,000 stars, naked women running all over the place, and the comedians that were. I once did a paper on the Follies and the reviews, and you find a major thing there wasn't so much that you had naked girls, which you could get from one review to the other, but when you've got a cast that has Eddie Cantor, W.C. Fields, Fanny Brice, and Will Rogers, all on the same stage at the same time, you are going to get a pretty good show, no matter what the naked girls are doing there. So you're in that kind of a thing. It's the 20s. It's hedonistic. So you are going to be getting that kind of thing. And then, of course, you get Showboat. In the late 20s, that's Hammerstein and Kern trying to really develop the book musical and deal with things like miscegenation, the hero who is a heel, a definite story with tragedy in it. And you start getting that. And then, of course, with the 30s, it's the Depression hit. All the big reviews had to go under because of, the bankrollers didn't have any money anymore. So you get your smaller reviews, and you start getting a different kind of musical, a cynical musical, where the 20s were so uplifting and whatnot. But in the 30s, instead of getting sweet little Marilyn Miller as your heroine, you're getting gum-chewing Ethel Merman as your heroine, a tough lady, and a more mature thing. That's where Berlin, especially Cole Porter's coming into his own. So you're getting a cynicism in the 30s you don't get. And then by the 40s, of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein appear and completely change things around and give you the integrated musical. Dance must help tell the story. A serious story.
On Broadway.
Okay. You wanted
The whole kind of role of Broadway and the way that musicals, you have to have a hit, have to go to Broadway first.
Yeah, well, for years, Broadway was the vehicle for pop music. I mean, it was just, if you wanted a song done, that's Tin Pan Alley we were talking about and whatnot, you wanted to go to Broadway. That's where the major popular performers were. I mean, it was no secret that if Al Jolson sang your song, there was a very good chance that it was going to be a hit. So the best native composers of pop music were Broadway. I mean, okay, we're talking the 20s. I'm talking Irving Berlin and George Gershwin, or people like that, Brown da Silva Henderson. What other pop writers are we talking about now? If we're talking the history of pop music in this country, or where are we going? We're going to find those are the people we're talking about. It's going to work that way in the 30s. It's going to work that way in the 40s too. Though by that time there is competition. Competition from two areas. One, the movies. And you'll find a lot of people who are writing for the movie musicals are the same guys who are writing for Broadway. I mean, when Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers do their series of films in the 30s, you're going to find that Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, and Jerome Kern are the people who wrote the music for them. The same thing occurs with a couple of the others. Rodgers and Hart go to Hollywood for several years as well. So they go there. But again, with films, they develop their own composers who turn out the hit songs that win Academy Awards and whatnot in the 30s. But even so, Broadway is still a vehicle for a lot of the pop music, and it happens in the 40s too. Rodgers and Hammerstein, followed by Lerner and Lowe. I remember as a kid listening to the radio and hearing songs like On the Street Where You Live, I Could Have Danced All Night, etc., which were pop top 10 tunes coming right out of My Fair Lady. By the 60s, I think there's a change. And by the 60s, a lot of the pop writers are finding they don't need Broadway that much for popularity. The record business has taken off like anything. It was going along in the 40s, but the 50s is the era of the top 10 tunes, top 20 tunes, top 50 tunes. And again, we get the influence of the black musicians who really weren't on Broadway. They were doing their thing off Broadway, but rock and roll hits in the 50s. And rock and roll is the pop culture music of the period, but it's not the pop culture music on Broadway. Broadway starts becoming conservative. So you're still getting songs which were great. What happened was rock and roll took over, and Broadway did not embrace rock and roll. Rock and roll was really a black music that white America, the teenagers, took over. But Broadway stayed an older age group with a bunch of white conservative musicians turning out the scores year after year after year. You don't get rock hitting Broadway until the late 60s, with 15 years after it's appeared. Elvis has been around a heck of a long time. By that time, the Beatles have been around, the Rolling Stones, and none of this influences Broadway. You've got to wait until Hair shows up in about 69 for the rock musical to show up. So as a result, there's this divergence. Also the divergence in cultures between the fact that pop music once embraced everybody. The parents and the kids could all listen to the same music. But when you get to the 50s, the kids get their music and the parents get their music. And the kids don't go to musicals. The parents go to the musicals. Or few kids go to the musicals. Let's put it like that. So as a result, the pop music goes off into this completely different area, which is really the kids' area. And the parents go to the older-fashioned musicals, at least in New York or whatnot. They don't write tunes like they used to. Well, heck, just go to shows in the 60s and the 70s. Hear the type of music that are in most of them, and you are going to see that they are not using rock music. You can go through the big hit shows, and they are just not using that kind of music at all. I mean, Man of La Mancha, Cabaret, etc. They will usually go to a historic period and adapt some sort of national idiom that they will modify. Fiddler on the Roof. See, again, you just, there's the divergence there. But until, I'd say, rock and roll hits, pop music, a lot of it is coming out of Broadway.
In that divergence, what happens, or at least what I think happens, is that Broadway becomes much more elitist.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Again, just the prices tell you it's elitist. I mean, $50, $60 a ticket. They had a series recently on a TV station I watched that said the average budget for a Broadway musical now is $7 million. Well, if you have that much, and we're just talking the average budget, not weekly expenses, which can run into the hundreds of thousands, they need a heck of a lot of people paying a heck of a lot of money, which most of us don't have. There's a difference between a $5 movie ticket and a $50 or $60 theater ticket. You can only, pay for one or two of those, and then you're broke. As I said, when I started out as a kid, you could see, for $50, you could see every show on Broadway and probably get a pretty good seat. The musicals, the comedies, the straight dramas, and whatnot. That situation doesn't exist anymore. So that's been the diversion, too. And yes, Broadway has become, to a degree, elitist. Where I work, with the shows we do, they don't like the new ones. And many times you can't do the new ones. The new ones are just too expensive. I saw the Phantom of the Opera last night. I was very impressed with the technology, but I come from a place where we have a theater that seats about 700 people. It's a nice old theater. It was built and opened in about 1900. And it was built for the theater of that age. I'm watching the Phantom of the Opera. Now I'm saying, okay, give me a couple of $1 million, the best talent in the world. I'll be able to do that too. But if you want to put that thing up on that stage, forget it. There's no way. But if you want to put on earlier musicals, if you want to put on Rodgers and Hammerstein or Lerner and Loewe, something like that, we can do it. They were made for that kind of a theater. See? Again, just doing something like the Phantom of the Opera, just look at the technology involved. They've got to get the big bucks out of you. With a show by Rodgers and Hammerstein, which can be done practically anywhere, they didn't need the big bucks because they didn't use the technology. It was a well-known fact that the way you staged a show was you did a big scene, and then you drew a curtain and had a short scene in front of the curtain while they changed the set behind the curtain. Then you opened it up and had another big scene, and you kept alternating that way. And that's the way they solved their pacing and technological problems. But here, get this 90,000-ton chandelier flying above the audience and the entire stage whirling around and going up and down and smoke everywhere. Special effects. Yeah, glad I saw it in Toronto because there's no way it's going to play where I live.
That's the issue about musical. We see it diverging and becoming a kind of elitist form.
And intellectual, I'd say that too. In the old days, musicals appealed to your gut. I mean, there was never a more sentimental human being on this planet than Oscar Hammerstein. And if you see a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, the emotional effect that you get that's what they're after. I mean, Maria waving to the nuns as she and the little kids go over the Alps from the Nazis brings a tear to the eye every time. The king dying and Anna holding his hand as the music swells with something wonderful. I mean, sniff, sniff, sniff. And that's what got me when I watched Phantom. At the times when the Phantom was on, at times there might be a slight emotional reaction. But for me, I just watched it and just watched this technology at work. And I really couldn't get that involved with what was going on. I might call it the Sondheim influence to a degree too, because your big poobahs right now in the musical theater, for Americans, it's Sondheim. For the Brits, it's Lloyd Webber. Those are the two. And Sondheim, he might say, I'm as emotional as can be, but here is a very intellectual, a very cynical person who is writing musicals which for decades were about as uplifting and happy. Again, take someone like Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin did not know depression. Irving Berlin said, God bless America, there's no business like show business. I'll see you in the Easter parade if we're not sitting around the fire enjoying a white Christmas. This was Irving Berlin. But then you get to Stephen Sondheim with the things he's doing, and you listen to the lyrics and you say, that's very intellectually challenging. I'm glad to see the perceptions which are coming out here. But when it comes to the emotion you're supposed to be getting, he's very sophisticated. He's giving you a lot of intellectual wordplay, games, etc. You can appreciate him on this level. But the last time I met anybody who said they came out of a Stephen Sondheim show with the tears welling in their eyes, that doesn't happen. Just doesn't happen. In the old days it did. You go to Man of La Mancha, you're going to cry. It's as simple as that. But with Sondheim, it doesn't work that way. You get that harder edge there. And a lot of Lloyd Webber's the same way, too.
We have John Fisker, so one of the reasons we can talk about in our paper is that it's really felt how to die. It's sort of an experience that he got early.
Right.
And once you move away from there, you move into kind of cerebral approach.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. That for us, when we go to an entertainment, what do we want? Do we want an intellectual experience or do we want an emotional experience? Now, obviously, somebody's going to say, well, I go for both. But when you go, what do you go for? Do you want to feel something or do you want to think about it? I know with me, if I want to think about it, I'll go to a college class. If I want to experience it, I want something else. When I work in theater, and that's the thing I do, not so much where I teach, though, yes, I've directed musicals for them. But I'm into a community theater group, too. And every year for the last 7 years or 8 years, we've put on musicals. And the thing about the musical is you want them to feel. Theater is such an immediate thing out of all of the entertainment media. It's the one that gets right to you. I mean, they're live, they're on stage, and many times they're not going to stay up there. They're going to come down, and you're going to become part of the action, too. That is at times possible, and I've always loved that idea, that direct connection with an audience. And every musical that we've done has been an emotional one. The first one we did was The Music Man, which is about as sentimental and treacly as could be. But there was a scene in it that brought down the house every night when we did it, where the Music Man was being chased by this lynch mob because they decided he was a phony who was defrauding them out of their money. And we had him race off the stage, down the aisle, behind the audience. He started going down the next aisle to get up on the stage again, and then he stopped and ran into the audience and sat on somebody's lap. And the people who were chasing him ran right back on the stage, and when that happened, they loved it. That was the part of the entire show which the audience loved more than anything else, because it was so immediate and so emotional that whatever you were seeing, you were part of it. it immediately was encompassing you. And that's something you don't see that much anymore in musicals. Or I don't know about the theater as general. Musicals are my area, that you don't see that you can do things like that.
Well, you see it, as you said, on the college level and high school level, where these kinds of performances could be put on because they're inexpensive, it's good training, and what have you. Do you see any kind of renaissance of that kind of performance?
I don't know. And that's when we talk about the death of the American theater, I wonder about that. I wonder, because the shows that seem to be most popular with your audience are the older ones, for various factors, I think. Again, usually the level of writers, the people who are doing it, the composers. I mean, we're talking Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Loewe, Frank Loesser, George Gershwin, etc. That's the bunch we have there, Jerome Kern. Who do we have now who's comparable? And I really don't think we do have anybody who is that comparable in theater, in the musicals. The great, the ones who would have been the generation aren't there. They've gone into rock videos, they've gone into film, they've gone into concerts, but they have not gone into the musical theater as such. It just might be a coincidence that in the 60s, notice, we stopped getting the generation of great composers, and we got the generation of the great choreographers. So that you had Fosse, you had Bennett, you had Gower Champion, etc., that bunch, who created shows which were more spectacles. In other words, you want to see the big dances or the approach that Bennett would use here or what Fosse would be doing, but all of a sudden the composers. In other words, in the 1950s, you went to The King and I, you went to a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. That was the selling point right away. When we get to the 60s and 70s, you go to Pippin, and it is a Bob Fosse musical. And who wrote the music and lyrics for Pippin? Well, Stephen Schwartz actually did, but it's a Bob Fosse musical. The same thing with the chorus line. The name you inextricably link with the chorus line is Michael Bennett. That's the Michael Bennett Show. The fact that Marvin Hamlisch wrote the music, and he's a very well-known composer, is nothing. It's the fact that it's the Bennett Show. So we see this influence, I guess, on the visual appearing in the 60s and the 70s with the big talents, the composers who used to dominate. They're not there anymore. They're somewhere else. See, and how do you get them back? I don't know if we can because of the changes in media and popularity. I don't know if we will. But I think the people we did get, who tend to be intellectual and tend to look back, and Sondheim, somebody like that, have taken away from the things that used to sell the musicals. When I do a show up in Houghton, or the Calumet Theater where I do it, I can usually find that if I do something by Rodgers and Hammerstein, no problem. I will sell out that theater like anything. All I have to do is say Rodgers and Hammerstein. I don't have to put a poster up. Sound of Music, something like that, they'll show up. If, however, I say I'm doing the Stephen Sondheim show, the reaction usually is, who is Stephen Sondheim? In this show, any tunes I know, anything I've heard of, you do Sound of Music or The King and I, they know. There's a little glimmer on their face. The Music Man, they've heard of it. But Stephen Sondheim, you can say, well, he's done Into the Woods. What's that about? Any tunes? Well, he did Pacific Overtures, A Little Night Music, Bring in the Clowns. Oh, Bring in the Clowns. Then they've made the connection. Maybe you'll get more of your audience that way until they see the show. Then they will tell you it is boring and esoteric. But until then, they might go and see the darn thing. And with Lloyd Webber, Lloyd Webber is probably the one exception in one definite way. He is a pop composer who can write popular standards. In other words, irrespective of the show, he will write one tune or something in that show that's going to take off. Even the earliest one, right? The Jesus Christ Superstar. I don't know how to love him. You could hear that and yet not know it was from a musical. And you can go through Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, whatever, all the way through Cats. And you will find he has the talent of doing it. He's practically the only one. I'd say on Broadway, the one who is the throwback to the old-fashioned generations, Jerry Herman, who had that talent for doing that too. He gives you uplifting shows and whoopee-doo stuff with old-fashioned music. He's Hello, Dolly, Maine, and the titles themselves tell you the popular tunes that he's able to create out of them. But even with Jerry Herman, you see him every few years, and then you don't see him anymore. Years ago, I went to the Goodspeed Opera. They were having a convention, a conference for people interested in musical comedy. And one of the speakers there was Sheldon Harnick. And Sheldon Harnick is the guy who wrote Fiddler on the Roof, the lyrics. And he was asked, he and his partner had not written a Broadway musical by that time for about 7, 8 years. And he said, you are guys who at this period have written probably the most popular musical, the longest running musical in the history of the Broadway stage. How come you haven't done any more musicals? And Harnick said, well, my partner Jerry Bach put it, they don't want our music anymore. They don't want our shows anymore, so we can't get the backing to do it. So they're not doing it because they don't think there's an audience out there or people who are willing to pay the way, etc. What they do think is you've got an audience for Les Mis, you've got an audience for Weber, you've got an audience for Sondheim, but not for these guys. Which is sad because I do think there is one out there. I do think if you're going to sell it on that emotional thing. The high culture thing is going to deal with a smaller audience. But all the time is they're just not going to go to think about the great subjects of the world. Who's going to take Laurie to the box social is the kind of thing usually a musical audience will concern itself with.